Delighted to welcome everyone to the last panel of the day. So we stand between you and 85 degrees or something out there. In fact, don't look out the windows because everyone's wearing bikinis. Well, not everyone, but almost. It was a bit strange coming over wearing my suit and my and my coat. Anyway, we're going to be talking about a hot topic today. Not quite as steamy as perhaps the view outside, but it is a very exciting topic about the geopolitics of Eurasian energy. So certainly something to keep our attention for the last session. And it very much seems that China is the focus of this panel, whether this is by accident or actual fact, the acknowledgement of the critical role that China is playing as a centre of demand and potentially also as a place down the line where there could be even more interesting developments on its own energy front. That is going to be the central element here. We've got three very distinguished scholars whose biographies are in your booklet. All of them have been colleagues of mine one way or another at different points. We've been partners in crime, and it's nice to see all of them in their various guises here. I won't tell you what crimes, but you'll probably find out at some point. We have Erica Downs, who's still my colleague at the Brookings Institution, who is going to start off with talking about the current state of Sino-Russian energy relations. And of course, we've just had Mr. Xi make his first big visit to China, and lots of speculation about what did he really agree to do with Mr. Putin down the line, and Erica will enlighten us on that fact. Then we will move seamlessly into BOBO, who many of you know from the book that he wrote about Chinese-Russian relations, dispelling many of the myths about that relationship at a time several years ago where there was all this speculation about the axis of energy. You'll all remember that, and BOBO, I think, put paid to that debate, but also is going to give us some insight now about what these deals really mean for Russia. And then is Russia really pivoting toward Asia? Which, of course, is one of the big claims of not just Russian energy experts, but certainly on the political front. And then Roger is going to bring us back, I can't say closer to home because it's going to be off into another area, but one that we've already talked about in the last panel, and looking at Caspian and other areas, about what all of this means for Central Asia and then the United States. And Roger has been working on central issues for an extremely long time, including in many different venues, out in Garmisch-Partenkirchen at different points of the Marshall Center, and now at NDU. And Roger will wrap everything up for us into a very neat conclusion. I'm confident of it. So Erica, over to you first. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to spend my time talking about the China-Russia energy relationship in the wake of Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow last month. And there are 3 points that I'm going to elaborate on in my time today. The first one is that the series of non-binding energy agreements signed during Xi's visit to Moscow set the stage for increasing the flows of oil, coal, and natural gas from Russia to China. The second point I'd like to make is that the key to finalizing these deals is likely to be Chinese capital, primarily in the form of loans from the China Development Bank, which we heard a bit about on the previous panel. And then the third and final point I'd like to make is that the China-Russia energy agreements signed last month are part of China's broader efforts to build stronger relationships with emerging economies by financing and developing new infrastructure and institutions aimed at tightening China's links to these economies. And so back to the beginning, as many of you know, when President Xi was in Russia last month, there are a series of energy agreements signed. I'll run through those quickly. One, Rosneft pledged to triple the amount of oil it delivers to China from about 300,000 barrels per day today to as much as 1 million barrels per day at some point in the future. A second agreement involved China's Shenhua Group, which is the world's largest coal producer producer, and Russia's EN Plus group, and they agreed to develop coal resources and related infrastructure in eastern Russia. And of course, in terms of gas, Gazprom and China National Petroleum Corporation, or CNPC, signed yet another memorandum of understanding for pipe gas to China. This one calls for the delivery of 38 BCM of gas to China over 30 years via the eastern route, starting in 2018 with the option of increasing deliveries to 60 BCM. And of course, as many of you know, there's a compelling logic to this pipeline for both countries. Russia is looking to diversify its markets, and certainly for China, a supply contract of this size would help fill the projected gap between China's natural gas demand and China's domestic supply in 2020, which was projected last year by CNPC to reach about 150 BCM. Now, as many of you know, who watch the China-Russia energy relations, every time there's a summit, there are agreements signed, and a lot of these don't move very quickly, if at all. However, the reason I'm a bit optimistic this time is because of the role that Chinese capital looks like it's going to play in each of these agreements. First, if you look at the Rosneft's pledge to increase oil deliveries to China, at least in the Chinese press, these are being linked to a $2 billion loan that the China Development Bank will be extending to Rosneft. And in the Chinese press, it's being talked about the oil deliveries being used to secure the loan. Second, if you look at the coal agreement between Shenhua Group and EN Plus Group, that is being financed by CDB. The bank agreed to extend a $2 billion line of credit to explore coal resources and develop the infrastructure needed to bring that coal from mine to market, probably markets in China. And I suspect that in the case of the natural gas pipeline, that money from China Development Bank, probably in the form of a multi-billion-dollar loan, may be key to breaking the impasse over price. Again, as we heard on the last panel, for many years now, that's been the final sticking point between the two countries. And my sense is that a loan from China Development Bank could help break that. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is that recently Gazprom's deputy CEO indicated that Gazprom might be willing to reconsider its position that its standard terms of deliveries for European customers should apply to China if China were to provide a loan that could be repaid with natural gas exports. And of course, as many of you know, China has had great success both in Russia and also with Central Asia in terms of extending, using oil-backed and natural gas-backed loans to get infrastructure. Again, back in 2009, China Development Bank, was the institution that provided the combined $25 billion in oil export revenue-backed loans to Rosneft and Transneft that broke the stalemate over the spur from the East Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline to China. And of course, CDB has an established track record in Central Asia as a force for regional economic integration, in that, it's the bank that provided a large part of the financing for the Kazakhstan-China oil pipeline, for the Trans-Asia natural gas pipeline, and it's also helping to bankroll the oil natural gas pipelines currently under construction from Burma to China. And then this brings me to my last point, which is that I see the China-Russia energy deals as part of China's broader efforts to build stronger relationships with emerging economies by financing and developing new infrastructure, new institutions to tighten China's links to these economies. As some of you may know, when Xi made his trip to Russia last month, that was his first trip abroad as China's new president, but it wasn't the only stop on his trip. It was the first one, but he also went to Africa, where he visited Tanzania, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Africa, where he also attended the BRICS summit. And one of my colleagues at Brookings, Sun Yun, argued in an op-ed written on the eve of this trip that one of the purposes of Xi's trip to Russia and to Africa was to help ease a sense of international isolation in China, due in large part to tensions in its relations with the United States, Japan, other countries in East Asia. And one way to ease that isolation, of course, is to strengthen ties to other countries. And in my view, the main tool that she used on this trip to Russia and to Africa to attempt to reduce China's isolation can be summarized in one word, and that's infrastructure. In Russia, she gave a speech in which he talked about oil and natural gas pipelines functioning as an artery connecting China and Russia in the 21st century, like the Tea Road did in the 18th and 19th centuries. Back then, it was Chinese traders bringing tea to Russia and bringing back fur. Today, it would be Chinese capital going to Russia in hopes of bringing back more energy supplies. In Tanzania and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chinese companies signed agreements with the host countries to finance and build ports. In South Africa, the China Development Bank agreed to provide $5 billion to Transnet, which is a rail freight company, to refurbish lines that are being used to ship coal, to carry coal and iron ore. And of course, at the BRICS summit in South Africa, China was a big proponent of the creation of a BRICS development bank, which would be used to fund infrastructure projects in emerging economies, although the details of that have not all been hammered out yet. My sense is that the Chinese approach of offering to fund infrastructure projects in other countries as a way of building relationships with some of those countries is probably a pretty smart one, because it allows China to counter the perception that China's relationship with these countries is just about extracting natural resources, that it's a relationship between colonialist and colony. I think that the Chinese government is acutely aware of the fact that China is often viewed as a new colonial power in Africa, and that's not just by Western countries, but increasingly by African countries themselves. Just a few weeks ago, the governor of the Nigerian central bank had made a comment in which he likened China to a new imperialist on the continent. And I think that China is also aware that, in Russia, there are also similar fears about becoming a resource appendage to China. And so I think that by providing money to host countries to fund infrastructure projects, that China can sort of counter that argument that it's not there simply to extract resources, that it's building the infrastructure that's needed to spur economic growth. And I think this is true not just for countries in Africa, but I suspect also in the Russian Far East and Eastern Russia as well. And of course, at the end of the day, China may still end up getting the energy and other natural resources that it wants and the jobs for its companies, but it's doing so in a way that I think that China hopes will generate less opposition. And I'll stop there.
One thing, just before we move to BOBO, Erica, perhaps that we could table for the end of the presentations. You obviously mentioned coal, and that isn't a major feature of today's conference, but the coal aspect of China's relationships. The United States is a major exporter of coal to China right now. Perhaps you could give us a few comments on that when we finish, because that's obviously part of energy security issues, and the interesting way in which coal is substituting in many respects for oil in the absence of gas, and the way that China has carved out some of these relationships might be interesting for people at least to hear in terms of that context. It's not something that gets talked about. And Erica, for all of you who have seen some of her earlier work on the Chinese Development Bank, is also doing an awful lot of work on China's role in all kinds of other commodities, including rare earths and other things at Brookings. So she's one of our top experts on those topics. If anyone wants to catch her on that, she'll probably curse me for that later, but anyway. Bobo.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you, Angela, for bringing me over to attend such an interesting, really stimulating conference. I wanted to address three issues today. The first is the one that's in the program, which is there really a Russian pivot to Asia? The second one follows logically on what Erica was talking about what is the significance of the recent Sino-Russian energy deals signed during Xi Jinping's recent visit to Moscow. And the third question, just to end up with a kind of more general geopolitical, geostrategic picture, is where does the Sino-Russian relationship today fit in with the global geopolitical map? So starting with, is there really a Russian pivot to Asia? I think there are 4 issues here. The first one that I see is that this is a triumph of illusion over substance. We talk about a pivot to Asia, or in Russia, we talk about the famous turn to the east. But this turn to the east is much more aspirational than real. Now, the Russian elite has begun to understand, belatedly, that Asia matters in and of itself. But there are few signs of concrete policy changes and very little sign of a change of mentality towards Asia. Asia remains a sideshow of Russian foreign policy. Why? Because Moscow's strategic and security focus, as you will be well aware sitting in Washington, is firmly on the United States. And Russia's economic ties and civilizational orientation is firmly biased towards Europe. And these biases are reflected in the most recent Russian foreign policy concept, the 2013 concept. Just as a little experiment, I thought I'd actually do a number count. There are 12 paragraphs on Russia's relations with the CIS. Europe gets 11 paragraphs. The United States gets 5 paragraphs. Even the Arctic, which Pavel Bayev said had been buried in the depths of the foreign policy concept, gets 2 paragraphs. What does China get? 1 paragraph. And what's more, it's not only that it's buried in the bowels of the foreign policy concept, it's that there's a lack of specificity. At least when the concept is talking about relations with Europe, the United States, there are concrete policy issues that are being discussed. The paragraph, the flimsy paragraph on China, is just about generalities. Notwithstanding the narrative of Western decline, there is an implicit belief in Moscow that the West is still best, maybe not as best as it was before, but still best. Because far from viewing China, Asia, as partners for modernization, Russia actually sees China and other Asians as competitors for Western technology and know-how. Second issue, Sinocentrism. Now, if we are going to talk about a turn to the east, then it's clear that the so-called strategic partnership with China is the centerpiece of that turn to the east. In fact, I would say that Moscow doesn't have an Asia policy. What it has is a China policy, a China plus policy in Asia. Now, in theory, in an ideal world, Moscow would like to diversify its relations in Asia, but the problem is it doesn't know how to achieve this. While the Sino-Russian partnership has acquired a certain bilateral substance, it remains true that Moscow identifies the principal value of this relationship in instrumental terms. The first is to counterbalance what it sees as the overweening power and arrogance of the United States. And the second is because an association with China confers on Russia, at least in the Kremlin's view, a success by association. And this is the principal reason, by the way, why Putin attaches such importance to the BRICS, far more than any of the other leaders. Unfortunately, such instrumentalism has ensured that Russia's engagement in Asia is effectively hostage to the ups and downs of its relations with the United States. And this has prevented any real continuity in Russian policies towards Asia, and crucially, has undermined its credibility there. Moving on to the Russian Far East. Now, in an ideal world, Moscow hopes that the Russian Far East will be a hub of intra-Asian cooperation. Unfortunately, the failure of modernization and the rule of law in the Russian Far East, but really across the country, has made this vision utterly improbable. The Russian Far East, as you will know, any of you who have been there, remains thoroughly backward and dysfunctional. Throwing money at the problem is, frankly, neither sufficient nor sustainable. And Moscow has tried attempts at direct rule, most recently through the creation of a Ministry for Far East Development, but they have achieved little. Meanwhile, Russian efforts to attract Asian investment into the Russian Far East have been largely unsuccessful. So what this leaves us is with a fourth point, which is that Russia remains a peripheral actor. It dreams of becoming, as they say, a Euro-Pacific power. But its footprint in Northeast Asia is minuscule. In fact, Russia accounts for only 1% of trade in Northeast Asia. It has no discernible influence on security decision-making in the region. And even areas of relative success, like the Sino-Russian relationship, you think, oh, 88 billion, that's fantastic. 88 billion is 2% of China's total overseas trade. Russia's hosting of the APEC summit in Vladivostok, with hindsight, appears increasingly to have been a one-off Olympic moment, rather than the trigger for a qualitatively new approach towards Asia. The sad reality is this, that Asian elites not only do not regard Russia as an Asian country, but doesn't matter actually all that much. They just don't regard it as a credible player in Asia. They believe it has very little to contribute. Yes, some energy exports, in some cases some arms, but very little other than that. And this means that Russia, for the foreseeable future, the future that I can foresee anyway, will remain a peripheral presence in Asia as long as it is distracted by this, frankly, global, grandiose vision of being a independent pole in a tripolar world order, where it sees itself as an equal, in effect, to the United States and China. As long as it pursues this illusion, this mirage, it's really got no chances of having a genuine turn to the east. Now, a few comments on the Sino-Russian energy relationship. In many ways, of course, Russia and China appear to be natural energy partners. But the trouble is, the cooperation between them, as a number of speakers have pointed out, has been very disappointing, certainly if you're sitting in Moscow. And even though we have seen the opening, belated opening, of the east side of the Daqing branch line to the East Siberian Pacific Ocean oil pipeline, and this has led to increased oil exports, Russia still accounts for only 6-7% of China's total oil imports, well behind Saudi Arabia and Angola. In fact, it's quite interesting. Russia's contribution to Chinese oil imports today is substantially less than it was in 2006, when it accounted for 11%. Today, 6%. Now, Xi Jinping's recent visit has encouraged hopes that Russian oil exports will expand. But I think Erica was careful to use the terminology sometime in the future. It's a very, yes, they'd like to do that. It's all very well to throw figures out, but there is no specificity here. I believe that Russia will remain a niche, a supplementary, rather than a core supplier of Chinese oil requirements. Because for all the talk about choke points in international sea lanes, the actual amount that Chinese have imported through international sea lines has increased significantly over the past decade. It used to be below 70%, now it's 80%. 50% Middle East, 30% Africa. In fact, it's probably more than that. We factor in Latin America as well. And I believe that this trend is unlikely to be reversed anytime soon. Moving to gas. I perhaps take a slightly different view to Erica. I don't think that the latest agreement changes very much. There have been several such framework agreements, memorandums of understanding in the past, including ones that mentioned figures. But I remain to be convinced that there is any concrete evidence that Moscow and Beijing are closer to an actual supply agreement. And here there are several problems, because cooperation, or the preventing cooperation, is not just about price. Yes, there's a very big difference in price. But there are also Moscow's fears of overdependence on China. There is its consequent refusal to allow the Chinese to acquire substantial equity in Russian energy projects. In fact, there's a sort of a classic saying here in Russian, "Только не китайцы," anyone but the Chinese. They would rather have the Indians, the Japanese, they certainly want the Americans, they certainly want the Brits, the Dutch, Norwegians, anyone, but the Chinese, no, not keen. And so the Kremlin tends to look at China as a partner of last resort. This was the case, by the way, in the much advertised 25 billion oil for loan in 2009. The reason that went through wasn't just that the Chinese put up the capital, it was also that the Russians were fresh out of options. No Western bank or financing institution would give the Russians the money to sustain Rosneft and Transneft. They had to go to the Chinese, and naturally the Chinese extracted their pound of flesh. Now, it's possible, of course, that the two sides may eventually conclude a gas supply agreement. You've got to think that surely it must happen one day. But actually the opposite is no less plausible. Because over the next decade, the Chinese are committed to importing increasing amounts of LNG from Australia, from Qatar, Indonesia, Malaysia. They're committed to importing ever larger amounts of Central Asian gas. And so it's quite possible that Chinese interest in Russian gas may actually decline, strange though that may seem. Because particularly if they look, and they are relatively successful in developing their own large shale gas deposits, they actually manage to push renewables up to comprise 15% of energy consumption by 2020. That's the plan. It may not happen. There's also an option that we should consider, that the Chinese may think, just picking up on Matt's idea, that you've had a big meal, the dessert had better be pretty good. If the dessert's not good, they may just go back to coal. They may be seduced by this idea of clean coal technology. So I think in the short to medium term at least, Europe will remain by far Russia's largest market for oil and gas, and Beijing will view Russia as merely one among its growing number of energy suppliers. I think in East Asia, the Kremlin will certainly continue to explore possibilities with South Korea, with Japan, but I think the prospect, particularly of the latter, has receded, particularly following the return of the Liberal Democratic Party and Tokyo's likely renewed commitment to nuclear energy. So third question, where does this all stand? Where does the Sino-Russian relationship, what does it mean in the global geopolitical map? Well, the simple answer is actually not that much. I think Sino-Russian convergence is one of the most overrated geopolitical issues of our time. Now, the Putin regime subscribes to the fashionable notion of the global shift in power to the east, which it understands principally as the rise of China at the expense of the United States. And it believes that this shift is beneficial to Russian interests. It accelerates the emergence of a polycentric system. It creates new opportunities for geopolitical balancing and for Russia to be some kind of civilizational or strategic bridge between East and West. And although they're uncomfortable about the rise of an overly powerful China, right now this is less of a concern than what Moscow perceives as US-led efforts to constrain Russia's resurgence. However, this may change, because Moscow has no more liking for a hegemonic China than a so-called unilateralist United States, much less for a Sino-American G2+, in which it effectively finds itself on the sidelines. By the way, Putin's Eurasian Union project, Hillary Clinton might call it a re-Sovietizing venture, but another way of looking at it is a counter-Chinese influence in Central Asia venture. We should understand, I think, that although Moscow and Beijing agree on much, there are many areas where their interests and priorities differ substantially. And ironically, the most important difference is in their respective attitudes towards the United States. Because notwithstanding all the problems in Sino-American relations today, Beijing regards the United States as its only true analog, its one truly indispensable partner. Moscow hopes that it can tap into Chinese unhappiness about the White House's rebalancing towards Asia. But in fact, the Chinese scarcely view Russia as a capable or even willing counterweight to the United States. Now, picking up on a point that Erica raised, I think certainly the Chinese, they're feeling a little isolated in Asia. And they want a friendly face. But do you think this friendly face is sufficient to counterbalance the United States? They don't. They really don't see it in those terms. For its part, Moscow does not seek an alliance with Beijing. This would be incredibly committal, and it would stop it from being that independent pole, being that civilizational bridge, exercising those strategic balancing possibilities. Certainly, if the United States and China ever got into any confrontation, Moscow would run for the hills. Russia and China will, of course, continue to work together in areas where they identify common interests. That means pushing the primacy of national sovereignty against Western-led moral interventionism. That means rejecting criticisms about human and political rights in their own countries, condemning missile defense, and so on. And this is certainly irritating to US and European policymakers. But we need to retain a sense of proportion here. Sino-Russian partnership can certainly be tactically disruptive, but it is not strategically threatening to Western interests. And the reason for this is because it's not a strategic partnership, but it's a deeply cynical partnership or axis of convenience. Both sides will not hesitate to screw the other if the need or opportunity arises. I'll leave it at that.
And now for something completely different. Let me make sure I get everything in order here. And also to make sure I bring a little timepiece, because we can go on and watch the sunset, and I don't want to leave you with that. As the last speaker here for the day. It's been an interesting challenge. On the one hand, I've enjoyed hearing presentations that confirm what I'm about to say, and I sort of make notes to myself. Thank Speaker X, that was a wonderful point. And others have completely shattered arguments that I thought I might challenge. So it's been a rework in progress. We'll see. But the point here is really to, as was suggested, to partially wrap this up by bringing it to the center, to Central Asia, to where the two countries, China, Russia, perhaps are still competing with interests where the U.S. still plays a part. And of course, when we look at the energy questions, as Terry Savanas-Helf clearly stated in the last panel, there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of opportunities and options ahead. What I'd like to do is sort of take a look really at how the Central Asian states fit into this environment. If we look at the Russian-Chinese relationship, I should just make a quick personal caveat here. Just came back from China yesterday, hence the cough, because in Beijing, the air quality was amazingly bad these last 2 weeks, 10 times above the scale of what it should be. It was like a 300, 400 day. So I wasn't one of the ones wearing a mask, and I regret that. But many of the points that we discussed here today were raised by Chinese counterparts, and some of the fears and concerns of where the energy market is going, where the geopolitical competitions might be, are critical in their calculus of where to project power, if in fact they want to project power. And I don't mean military power, other forms of power. And also where they see Russia play a part, where they see the Central Asians stay apart, and most assuredly where they see the United States. What made it an interesting set of discussions, of course, is their perceptions. We would look at them and consider them misperceptions, and they would look at us as well. We seem to be talking at cross purposes, and hence I think some of the misunderstandings that we have before us and that we've outlined in good detail today. But what I should say is that when we look at our Central Asian states, where do they fit in? Where can they take advantage of this situation? What lies ahead? Where are we going? And perhaps in 10 years, what might the next conference be about? If we look at our friends in Kazakhstan, here's an interesting case. It's a country that for 20 years, as we've noted already, has been developing, exploiting its energy on its own in commercial partnerships with other states, other companies, and is now exporting in multiple directions. It's developing its own talent pool to be able to supply and manage this infrastructure. It is a maturing system. We think of these, again, the phrasing of, are these developing economies? They are, but perhaps we're having a maturing population in terms of energy, but also a population that's going to make the same mistakes that other energy-producing states have made over time. I think one of the subtexts of the book, The Prize, is when you see countries, including the United States, Saudi Arabia, and others, when they earn great wealth, there's many, many ways to squander that. And sometimes you have to do that once or twice and go through some boom and bust times to realize that this is something you need to think long term. The Kazakhs have faced this to some extent, and obviously they're going to have to face this in the coming years. Turkmenistan is really the underachiever. Now, I know it's easy to make it the butt of all jokes, and we talk about the political system, leaderships, etc. But just from, if you want to say, an objective or rational perspective, here's a state that does have great potential, great wealth, and we keep using this word potential. If we were to have held this conference in, 1994, we would have said the same, and we would have looked at export routes that look strikingly familiar to the ones under discussion today. The question here is not a matter of, are they going to get on, the right page, and are they going to exploit this, but rather have they run out of time? Because as we've seen, markets are moving quickly in other directions, and the advantage that Turkmenistan had in 1993, 1994, 2001, 2006 isn't quite there today. Yes, they have a pipeline off to China. This is great. They're looking in other directions, but honestly, their opportunities I think, are dwindling because perhaps they've waited too long for these discussions. And if gas truly is like water, well, they have a lot of water to sell. For the other three states, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, again, an interesting mix. Our Uzbek colleagues have decided to go down the path of autarky. Self-sufficiency is key, and perhaps in turbulent times, it's not a bad idea to set your own house in order and make sure that's protected, and then perhaps later deal with your neighbors. But what they're going to learn, and what they are, I suspect, getting a whiff of, is being a transit state's maybe not a bad thing, that participating in regional efforts could help, but this innate mistrust of not just the bigger powers outside, foreign companies, Western organizations chiding them about domestic politics, human rights abuses, etc., but a mistrust of immediate neighbors, a mistrust of any routing that can go through and from their country is preventing them as well from engaging fully in a global market. And, in about 30 seconds, we can honestly say for our last two states, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who really haven't been mentioned here at all, and whether the Secretary of State pronounces the name properly or not, we can push that aside. But our good friends in Kyrgyzstan see themselves perhaps as an interesting competitor in the non-traditional energy forms if we're looking at hydropower, the same with our Tajiks, and we of course know where that's taking them in terms of regional competition. So in short, what we're looking at are states that are moving in different directions. To think of them as a single unit, to think of them as a collective moving in lockstep, of course, is years past. We have to think of them as 5 independent countries working on 5 independent strategies, and their relationships with both Russia and with China in particular are moving in these directions, again, in different directions. We've made a lot of references to the 1990s. And that's important because, of course, that's when energy was critical in the region, and that's when Central Asia first came on the map as an energy-producing area. And we looked at it as either-or. Either the pipelines go through Russia, and we have different routings in that direction, or we experiment with this interesting new route across the Caucasus, BTC. This either-or mentality for the main export pipeline dominated the thinking. In this town, there were conferences probably every 2 weeks on energy policies, energy security. The challenge was to see who was hosting it, what were they serving for lunch, and who was the speaker. And then you would reconnect with people, and it was, as Hemingway called it, a movable feast. See you in 2 weeks at fill in the blank. Today, it's much different. The market is 360 degrees. They're looking in all directions. And the opportunities and the challenges, I should say, are in all directions. We would joke about the Chinese pipeline on another time. The country that gave us the Great Wall will give us the Great Pipeline. They have it, and it's going to be built. More will be built. Again, this is not a hypothetical situation. It's a certainty, and there's a logic behind it. There's a geopolitical logic. I guess I'll defer to others to suggest whether it's an economic logic or not. But for all of the countries, again, big challenges ahead. These challenges really fall in a couple of quick categories. Of course, the economic challenges. Do they have the financing available, investment in these projects? The downside of, say, comparing to the 1990s was back then there was a lot of enthusiasm and optimism about moving into this market, and this could be a great opportunity. I sense today in 2013 exhaustion. A sense of, do we really want to invest in there again? We've been burned 14 times by this negotiating process. Can we stand a 15th? It's problematic. And truth be told, even a country such as China, which we would say, oh, they're going to throw money at everything. Well, on the contrary, they too are evaluating contracts meticulously and wondering whether it's worth their investment dollars because Central Asia is an option. They have others. And this is the key part for any investor, and of course, all the corporation folks here in the audience know this full well. Are the legal regimes in place? 20 years have passed. Do we have legal structures where states can work with each other across borders, determine tariffs and customs, etc.? And guess what? In most instances, they cannot. this is still problematic. You know, we talk about the Silk Road, the Great Silk Road, wonderful rhetoric that needs to be put into practice. Energy pipeline routes are wonderful ways to test this practice, and again, we're coming up with a lot of hiccups, whether it's through international organizations or simply a large profit motive to get something working. These are the challenges facing our region. We can't ignore the environment, you know, and talking about pollution rates in Beijing aside, the environment is critical when looking at the development in the region. And it's not just, you know, NGOs, whether it's Transparency International, Crude Accountability, Human Rights Watch, and others who look at the environment and determine, you know, environmental impact of energy exploration and exploitation in this area. You see this from the countries themselves and, quite frankly, from some of the immediate investors. The PLA's think tank, Advanced Military Studies program, is actually looking at environmental security of energy imports. They see this as a concern for China. Now, you know, we normally think of this as a Western motive and a Western idea, but on the contrary, we're seeing it in some of the neighboring states as well. Now, let's put that in perspective. We're still looking at preliminary discussions, and I don't think it's going to be as far advanced as what we've seen in others. And lastly, I should say, the security question. And this finally is where the U.S. comes in. I haven't really talked about the U.S. But the security issue is becoming front and center, a major concern for the countries in the region and those wanting to invest in those countries. And it's not just, can they maintain control over their own borders or the territory within their states? They've proven that. Yes, we've had hiccups. Yes, we've had a civil war. Yes, we've had violent overthrows of government and maybe not so violent overthrows of government. But all in all, it's been a pretty stable area. You know, that's, again, if we look at a long span of time, pretty stable. But the fears over the horizon are that, and this is where 2014 comes in, that dangers loom, that problems will arise in the South, and we're going to start to see challenges within the states emanating from the South. The discussion, you know, off and on, we've talked about TAPI, you know, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. Had the chance, actually the good fortune of being in Ashgabat when the political agreement was signed. They had the nice signing ceremony, right? And so the presidents are there, well, a couple of the presidents. You had India just sent their energy minister. That's how valuable they thought it. At the end, they had this concert, and they were playing traditional Turkmen music, then they were playing Western music with Turkmen instruments, and everyone was happy, and in the front row were the leaders of the four countries. And as is usually the case, there's that photo op moment, right, where you have the multiple handshake, where everyone gets to reach in and shake hands. And President Berdimuhamedov really wanted this to happen, and he's almost reaching the hands to pull together, and they didn't. Because our Indian and Pakistani colleagues were thinking, you know, this is not, this is not Camp David. We're not going to shake hands. And so they all sort of awkwardly sat there, and he was basically holding their hands. And that, it's a nice visual because it at least suggests that even though we say, yes, a political agreement was signed, there are tensions. There are tensions for sure. And if I'm a company looking at investing in this, do I want to immediately have a 15% markup on security arrangements, which will have to happen if the pipeline's going to transit through Afghanistan? You know, we go back to the old CENTGAS program of the 90s. The irony there was that security was less of an issue. It was more of, do we get the investment in? Can we get the Turkmen to finally put their name on a piece of paper in something other than invisible ink? You know, can we have a project that works? Today is different, and arguably all four countries, I'm including the Afghans as well, realize that security is the number one concern, and if this is the project that never happens, that's the reason why it won't happen, which is why we have, you know, the Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline route having much greater attention, or at least the IP, right, Iran, Pakistan, that portion happening. Sanctions be damned, our friends in Pakistan may very well want to follow through with this because they desperately need energy. If they can't get Central Asian energy, they're going to go through another source. So in the end, what does this mean for the future of not just investment in Central Asia and the relationship it may have with Russia and China, but for the U.S. itself. I look at these challenges. I mentioned security as the last one. This is the concern that probably puts the U.S. horse out of the race. And I say this because for 20 years, the U.S. has had an interest in the region. We know that. There are many in the room here who were there at the beginning. And we know that in the 90s, when you look at security interests, those were actually nominal. It was really about energy, and we actually had a concern about things like democratization, economic reforms, social welfare, stabilization, and all those other good things. I'll say that quickly. But energy becomes important by 96, 97. We move, to the early part of 2000, and of course, energy is the only issue that's raised in the national security strategy vis-a-vis Central Asia. It's the key question that drives U.S. policy in the region until September 11th, 2001, where security is going to bypass that. Well, now we're going to see security vanish as a concern. And I don't mean vanish completely, but obviously lessen. I'm still wondering whether we're going to have a status of forces agreement, and by January 1st, 2015, we'll not have a single soldier in Afghanistan, as what happened in Iraq. Maybe the number will be 2,500, maybe it will be 8,000, but it will not be 30,000, it will not be 25,000. And the dollars put in are going to drop precipitously as a result of that. Most likely, and in fact, we're already looking at figures of drops of 30 to 38% of funding in the region completely. That's both military and civilian. And for a country that has to rely almost exclusively on foreign aid, this is going to be a serious security challenge for Afghanistan. But for us, for the U.S., that pulls us out of the area. That pulls us out of Central Asia. Manas Transit Center. I think finally the Kyrgyz are going to have to cave into the Russian demands, and that base will pull down by 2015 or 16 at the latest. Betting pool is not a good thing. I just look at my Final Four brackets, so I'm not going to say anything more. But that's an option. The second issue added on to that, of course, is our own little wonderful world of austerity, and whether we want to call it the post-sequestered world. We realize that the U.S. is now looking at money in a fundamentally different way, and spending money in faraway places to provide security for energy for third parties may not be high on that list. And I do see a real concern in terms of the U.S. playing less and less of a role in Central Asia. And just I'll throw out one last thing. A basic bureaucratic inertia is that we simply don't have some alternative ideas to help support and replace these. And so, I not to sort of end on a depressing note, but what it's done is it's allowed us actually to think of other options. It's actually freed us to think of other choices. And oddly, these other choices go back to the very two countries that we started with in this panel, Russia and China. Yes, there is still a view sometimes in this city of a Cold War mentality, like a phantom pain that won't go away. We look at Russia as the post-Soviet Union, and we look at China, well, as China, except a really strong one now, and one that puts fear in our heart. But those concerns aside, these are also two states that, if they were to play an active role in investing in the region, the security challenges, the economic challenges, the political challenges of Central Asia could actually be lessened, and that's a good thing. Oddly, you're now seeing a discussion with these states, a discussion about, if the SCO actually engages in Central Asia, not necessarily a bad thing. Does this mean we'll be on the sidelines? Perhaps maybe not as active as we are today, but what we'll see is the United States probably playing a more pointed or target-specific role. We'll look at particular programs. We'll look at particular engagement issues. But don't expect us to be as engaged broadly in the energy competition that we've seen. And I think the presentations that have gone throughout today, starting from this morning, first presentation this morning, suggests that we're looking at a global market. We're looking at a global economy. So even if the U.S. isn't as active about a new Central Asian pipeline as we were about BTC, 15, 18 years ago, that's not a bad thing. This is not, sort of madness and death. This is not some, end of our presence in the region. And I'm sort of thinking on the plane over, I watched the movie Amour, which if you want to get depressed, see it. But you know, if that were to typify our presence in Central Asia and in if that were to typify our presence in Central Asia, smother me with a pillow. I prefer to look at Argo, you know, exciting, adventurous, and we have this great fictional escape in the end where good triumphs over our perceived evil. So maybe we move in that direction. But all that said, I'm looking forward for 10 years' time in the next conference we have going here. So I'll leave my remarks at that. Okay, thank you.
Well, Roger, you wrapped things up in a rather unexpected way. I guess now that Roger Ebert is no longer with us, you could, there's a new angle if Central Asia doesn't work out for you anymore. The geopolitical dimensions of Hollywood commentary, well done. Just before we go to the audience, I'd just like to check with our timekeeper, Angela. You have some closing remarks and then cocktails or... Good. As that sun keeps streaming in these windows, I'm very mindful of the fact that people might have their thoughts elsewhere. But there are a number of really interesting issues were put on the table here. I'd thrown out to Erica the challenge of coal, and maybe some commentary on that. And Bobo, you might want to also talk about that. And Roger, I mean, there were some really interesting aspects of Central Asia here, and it's also notable that we don't have anyone from India represented here. And you know, as you're saying, there were so many conferences in the 1990s that actually, I think nearly all of us were there, apart from some of the students who were, yes, otherwise engaged in the 90s. But the rest of us older people sitting around here remember them only too well, fondly, of course. But there were also a flurry of conferences on the role of India. And as you have, kind of pointed out that TAPI may not be quite as attractive as it has been, but there certainly has been lots of aspirational discussions of the role of India here, and maybe, I could challenge all of you on the panel to think, why didn't we include India? Because I have to say that I haven't been to a conference on India's kind of role in this general area for a long time, and how then are we changing indeed our geopolitical maps? The other kind of question is, and unfortunately I didn't get a chance to come over for the Caspian section of the conference, is how much is some of the other bigger developments in oil and gas changing things? And as you're hinting, and I'm not quite sure what you might have said before, the Turkmen may have waited a little bit too long to get into the game. It may also be a kind of a question down the line as we're seeing all these shifts in gas, the Eastern Mediterranean and many other areas coming on now that we hadn't really kind of thought about previously for a European context. Is gas going to be just pushed so much further down the line in many of our discussions? I mean, and then the one thing to ask about the China question, of course, again, a lot of speculation about China, its own shale gas, but water is a major commodity that you were saying gas like water, but unfortunately water is an area that we should discuss here because China certainly has water shortages. And although you mentioned, Roger, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and hydropower, we know from the melting of ice sheets that in fact they may not have as much water down the line as they may also have hoped. So water could be a major constraint in the region when we look ahead at the development. So I just wonder if we could throw some of these out and then bring everyone else in from the audience. So Erica.
Sure, I'm happy to tackle China, coal, water, and shale gas very quickly. In terms of coal, China imports coal. China's a net importer of coal, and so I think that's the backdrop for the deal with Russia. And of course, coal is a bulk commodity. You need a lot of infrastructure to move it, and I think that's where the China Development Bank, which funds a lot of infrastructure, comes in because you're going to need rail and stuff in place to move that from mine to market. In terms of water, there are many people out there who say that when it comes to to scarce natural resources in China, that the scarcest one, it's not oil, it's not gas, it is water. And and that I think plays into the shale gas issue, which BOBO had also talked on. As many of you know, on paper it looks like China has a heck of a lot of shale gas. Like back in 2011, the U.S. Energy Information Administration said that China had the largest sort of technically recoverable shale gas resources in the world, about 50% larger than in the United States. But again, that's just on paper. There isn't any. I don't think there's any commercial production of shale gas in China right now. And I think it's important to note that when it comes to sort of shale gas in China, I think the pace, it's important to realize that the Chinese government and PetroChina, which is a large oil company in China, which has the most exposure to shale gas in China and controls a lot of the pipelines, they're not on the same page in terms of the time frame. I think the government is more interested in having domestic shale gas produced sooner rather than later, where for PetroChina, it's very much a longer-term issue. And if anyone's interested, I can get more into this later. But just to quickly run through the topics that Fiona laid out.
Would the US and Russia be in any competition over any of these coal deals? Because it's quite phenomenal, the size of US coal exports to China right now. I mean, phenomenal for those who don't think about it normally, of course.
I think that the Chinese companies are interested in importing from both countries, and so I think it just sort of depends on
more coal, the
deals
better.
that are done. Yeah.
Bobo, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, a couple of quick comments. Coal currently accounts for 70% of China's total primary energy consumption. And Eric could have the figure on this, but I think they're committed to go down to 59% by 2035, something like that. The thing is, how are they going to do this? One way, of course, is if they increase renewables to at least 15% of the total mix. If gas goes up to, say, from the current 3 to 4% to up to, say, 10%, nuclear could go up. But what interests me is the other thing that could go down is not coal, but also oil. And I remember a conversation, a panel that I shared with Xia Yishan in Chatham House a few years ago. He used to advise Wen Jiabao on energy matters. And he was saying that the Chinese would be moving from oil to gas. So now, he didn't provide any details of that, but I thought that would be quite interesting to explore. On India, for a long time, the Russians have thought of India as a natural counterbalance to China in Central Asia. But there are a few problems with that kind of strategic calculus. The first is that for Russia to at least quarantine, vaguely manage the situation in Central Eurasia, they actually need the Pakistanis more than the Indians. So India becomes less important. The second issue there is if you get too close to India, you piss off the Chinese. That's never good. And the third issue is that the Indians, the big strategic shift in India, in New Delhi, is towards the United States. So again, it's my enemy's enemy is my friend, or my enemy's friend is my enemy. So this is an issue. That's why India, in Russian strategic calculus, has fallen down. I think in general, the reason we don't look at India much is because it's been a pretty disappointing strategic performer, an economic performer, arguably, in the last 2 years. It's really not kicked on. Many of the dysfunctionalities that we associate with India traditionally remain very much in force. Someone made the comment recently that if Manmohan Singh had retired in 2009, he'd have retired with a golden reputation. Now his reputation is considerably undermined. Finally, on water, Sergei Karaganov, among other people, has said that Russia can be an exporter of water to China. Well, because Russia has lots of water, China has less water per capita than sub-Saharan Africa, or northern China, that is. But the problem is that would require the reversal of all Russia's major rivers. Now, we've been down this path before. It's not going to happen. Really, it isn't going to happen in any... So this kind of dreamland stuff, I think, is frankly typical of a lot of the people that are advising the Russian government today.
Well, thank you, Bobo. So, Roger, and now you've got the China coal cough sitting next to us here. That kind of,
So no river diversion plan. Okay. No, actually, the one issue I would just tap into is actually tappy from the Indian point of view, and it's interesting because everything you said about the Indian, Russian, Pakistani, Chinese, U.S. relationship is absolutely true, and it's in that mix that the U.S. has decided India is our next best hope to actually help stabilize Afghanistan, because let's piss everyone off. You know, if it turns out that way, at least our neighbors. But on the other hand, if we're looking at a partner that is trusted in Afghanistan that we would want to put in there, oddly, it has become India. Which also means then investment opportunities for, trans-state pipelines, trade routes, et cetera. In perhaps a naive moment, there is even this sense of, well, if it's beneficial for China, if it's beneficial for India, won't they all work together? But as you've suggested, that may not necessarily be the case. But one other element to add for India is when you look at what direction they're moving, it is a sense of going from a global or from a regional player to a global player and learning how to do that. And that mindset is still taking place. It's still being shaped. To see themselves juxtaposed with Pakistan is an insult. Indo-Pak is fingernails on a chalkboard. Indo-China, that's good because those are big countries. But to think of it globally is critical here. Having said that, those in India, and I'm thinking of their strategic studies centers in Delhi and other places, I've had a chance to meet with a number of their Central Asianists, and repeatedly their Central Asianists make the claim, nobody listens to us, they don't fund our projects, the national government is not at all interested in this area, as said by Central Asianists around the world, and regardless of country. But in India, it's the same. They feel that they're not getting any respect, and so unless there's a shift in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and obviously in the national government broadly, this is going to remain, as some other people have suggested, a sideshow.
So on the message of Central Asians of the world unite, bring down free ourselves from the chains of oppressive governments who are not interested. Let's get some interested people from the audience. Maybe I'll take 3 questions at first, Jeff, and over here, and then. And was there somebody behind the I'm afraid I have actually restricted vision. Did someone put the hand over here? Okay, good. It was just somebody moving then. Jeff, and then, yeah.
Thank you. I guess this is mostly a question for Bobo Lo. I was hoping you could say something about what you thought of Russia's push for trade agreements with other partners in Asia, including India, Vietnam, possibly a Russia-ASEAN agreement. Yeah. How much substance is there behind those, and what would that do to the sort of overall strategic and economic balance?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Tom Simons. As a former ambassador to Pakistan, I'd like to keep the conversation going a little bit and maybe temper Roger's bleak vision of a U.S. evaporation from Central Asia. I mean, it's not only Russia that will need Pakistan. I think the U.S. is going to continue to worry about Pakistan. Pakistan and Afghanistan are going to continue to have the capacity to rot each other. And Central Asia is going to worry about Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So I think probably the U.S. is not going to simply evaporate from the area, but is going to continue to be interested. Now, that doesn't give a solution, but your final vision that we're not going to care except when we're having fun and watching movies, I think, is probably overdrawn.
Dr. Lo, you mentioned briefly Japan, very, very briefly, but does Japan play in Central Asia? What about, the Japanese-Russian relationships? I mean, you went over that very, very quickly, but is there more that you can tease out?
Sure.
Teresa? Yeah. Was anyone over here? I'm sorry, I've got the light blinding me a little bit here, but did someone over here as well? Don't want to miss anyone. Yes, there's a hand. I can't actually see behind the cameraman, but Teresa first and then the other person, yeah.
A much stronger sense of
Is the mic working?
Turkmenistan's satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the pipeline to China. I wondered if you could comment on China's satisfaction at this point with the pipeline from Turkmenistan.
And then the person who's only their hand I can see behind the...
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you.
I wanted to get back to the question of security, and maybe look at it and ask for the panelists' vision on it from a little bit of a different perspective. Roger mentioned fatigue after 20 years. And it strikes me that particularly in Kazakhstan, where we've had Western investment in the oil sector for 20 years, with very little of that revenue actually making it back to ordinary people, particularly in Western Kazakhstan, where the oil's being extracted and where the worst of the environmental degradation is also taking place. We saw the riots in Zhanaozen in December 2011. And I'd be interested to hear from the speakers sort of what your sense is of the security risks coming from inside the country. We've seen greater repression, we've seen crackdowns on civil society, we've seen lack of revenue transparency, disregard for the rule of law, and all of this taking place in an environment where investment continues to take place. So maybe looking at the security concerns from internally rather than looking at them from Afghanistan and point south. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we could probably put that across the whole of Central Asia. I mean, you alluded, Roger, to the leadership changes. Of course, in the case of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the leadership changes have been much anticipated and may or may not be imminent. The recent article on Uzbekistan, which is another one of those, a little bit like conferences over the past 20 years. We've all been there and talked about that many times, but Turkmenbashi did actually die eventually, and then it was, we never thought it would happen, and then of course it was almost like it never happened. He got replaced by somebody with just better dental surgery, but anyway, yes, yeah, exactly. But that internal risk issue is pretty current still with us. So Roger, why not start with you, and then we'll move back down, and we'll give Erica the final wrap-up.
Okay, I'll hit some of the points that I think I can at least attempt to address, and I'll let the experts deal with the rest. No, on the issue of U.S. engagement in the region, and to be clear, my concern, and this really is a concern, is that there's really no vision for what role we want to play in the broader Central Asian region, other than, and I hate to say this, executing projects. We used to have it. No, there were ideas, particularly right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were, and this went from whether it was George Herbert Walker Bush to Bill Clinton. So this is a right-wing, left-wing issue. That's irrelevant. There was a sense of coming in for assistance. There was a sense of looking at a vision of stable states, et cetera. The security dimensions that have come in over the last decade plus have taken its toll. It has skewed our engagement in the region, for better or for worse. It just has changed it because we've looked at our relationship in Central Asia largely through a securitized lens, largely through looking at Afghanistan. The energy issue does come up in discussions, but honestly, in terms of sort of broad government support, the feeling is that those can be taken up by other states or by private companies, again, how we would look at it. When we pull out, and we are, I mean, there is a withdrawal taking place out of Afghanistan, not just the U.S., but the other NATO countries. Can that be replaced with some other combination of states? I would argue that you'd have to look at a broader, in fact, you need to have a wider range of states, not necessarily a U.S.-led operation. And who knows what the organization will be, whether it's the UN, SCO, SARC, or some newly created structure that's based in the region. The Uzbeks offer 6+3, 6+5, whatever. But if there's another structure in place, we would be a part of it, but I would stress just a part. And as we look long-term, and whether this gets into sort of natural security habits of the U.S., where we've looked over time, say of a 50, 60-year span, it does tend to focus on several key countries globally. And if we even buy for a moment the notion of a pivot to Asia or a rebalance, a suggestion that there's going to be a Pacific century, although I do remember in the 70s there was a discussion of this now being the era of the Pacific Rim. And so we've gone through this cycle before. Maybe this time we'll actually do it. But somewhere in that mix, I do have a concern, and this is now just maybe some self-doubts, but a concern that regions like Central Asia get left by the wayside. Again, I see an engagement, but it's going to be very limited. Now, to your point on Pakistan, this is probably the biggest concern of all the states involved, and you're right. I mean, we haven't mentioned it really at all here. I see Pakistan far less stable than Afghanistan. I have greater concerns about Pakistani statehood than I do about Afghan statehood. Yes, and one is with the other. They are, interesting Siamese twins. And so if one is infected with a disease, the other will get it. And that's a concern you hear, by the way, in India, in China, amongst the Central Asian states, and yes, Iran, even though we're not supposed to talk to them. This is what they say. That everyone has a concern in this region. You hear this in the Gulf. You hear this in the United Arab Emirates, a concern about this implosion that could take place. But what you have, and this is a topic for a whole other set of conferences, is within Pakistan and in the leadership an inability to recognize this implosion. And that's, I think, the biggest fear in all of it. And you're right, the economic measures, and for China, by the way, Pakistan always feels that at the end of the day, China has their back, that China's their loyal ally. And in Beijing, that's a different thought process. So, long answer to that section. I would just say on the other issue that I would want to look at is the internal security challenges for Central Asia. These are matters that are going to come up. I mean, I think when you have systems where you see wealth being created, but perhaps it's not reaching all levels of society, you will find discontent. And in a number of countries that my organization has worked with, whether it's Yemen, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, Tunisia, Egypt, etc., you can see this. I mean, now when it will happen, who knows? First predictions of sort of an Arab Spring-like movement actually came out in the early 70s. Some State Department officials were raising concerns about the possibility of unrest in Egypt. They were 40 years early, but it took a while for things like that to happen. For Central Asia, is it going to happen, like Kyrgyzstan, where you can see almost a culture of protest, a habit of protest? Could this happen? Yes. In the other states, they get the information. They see what's happening. They have communications. And so could we see such protest continue? Well, as was already suggested, we've noticed this. And unless the states can actually address these concerns, and sometimes maybe it is just a cosmetic fix. I mean, I hate to say, but sometimes bread and circuses do matter. That could be enough. But maybe these forces are going to run deeper, and that would be very problematic, as we saw in 2010 in Osh. So, yeah.
Bobo.
Okay, to Jeffrey Mankoff's question. In an ideal world, Russia would like to have much more diverse relations in Asia, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. They would like to do much more business with the Japanese. They would like to have a normal political relationship with them. They would like to have much closer relations with the ASEANs, particularly, not just Vietnam, by the way, but a lot of them. The trouble is, are they prepared to take the steps necessary to achieve that kind of diversity? Part of the problem is this. One is a political dimension. Those Asian countries regard the Russians as basically being in bed with the Chinese. So that's one problem. The second problem is they regard Russia as a has-been great power. In other words, with very little to contribute. Yes, maybe some energy and raw materials exports, maybe some arms if you're a particularly backward Asian country. But other than that, what else have they got to offer? In the meantime, it was put to me, Angela's heard this story before. I once had a conversation with a senior Japanese diplomat about Russian participation in the Korean six-party talks. And I said, oh, do they exercise nuisance value? And he said, no value, just nuisance. So there is a sense that it's a pain in the butt. It has a sense of strategic entitlement without an accompanying ability to make things happen. It can only obstruct. It can never create. So, and that applies not just to security issues, but also to actually doing business. Focusing more closely on Russia-Japan. Roger would know this better than I would, but I get the feeling that the Koreans are more active players in Central Asia than the Japanese. But on the Russia-Japan relationship, this is a relationship based on mutual misunderstanding. The Japanese look at the Russians and they think, don't you get it? Don't you get the rise of China threatens us all? That this more assertive, even aggressive China threatens us all. And they think, surely the penny is finally dropping. And therefore the Russians will understand that they actually have to get much more strategically close to Japan. The Russians see the Japanese as being mired in historical disputes, not just with the Russians, but also with the Koreans, with the Chinese, with pretty well everyone. And they can't see why, what they see as a politically dysfunctional Japan, why the Japanese can't compromise. Putin was outraged. I mean, Angela was a witness to this. Putin was outraged that in back-channel diplomacy with Mori, former Japanese premier, that the deal that Mori was bringing, that basically if you come to a compromise on the islands, we'll give you that, we'll have the peace treaty and we'll just be able to draw a line under it. And Putin claims that the Japanese gave him to understand that they would move on this. And instead, when he, as he put it, expended political capital, and the Japanese, as he put it, reneged, that really killed it for him. That was actually a major reason why Putin actually went for the China pipeline to Daqing as well. An important political reason. Anyway, there is a sense that the Russians would love to have a good relationship with Japan. They see that Japan is much more technologically advanced than China, and just as importantly, much less strategically threatening. But unfortunately, we have two, again, major problems. One is the intractable problem of the territorial dispute, over which neither side, both nationalist politicians, feel they can afford to make any concessions. And then there's the other thing of just the sheer difficulty of doing business, which brings us to the question of Chinese satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the Turkmen pipeline. For all the difficulties that they may have had, the Chinese constantly compare the ease of doing business with the Central Asians, perhaps because they see them as rolling over, with the impossibility of doing business with the Russians. And here they compare this, what Xiao was saying was, we sign endless framework agreements, memorandums with the Russians, and nothing ever gets done. We do one agreement with the Turkmenistanis, Kazakhstanis, Uzbekistanis, and stuff happens. We not only conclude the agreement, we actually start implementing it. So bad though the Turkmens might be, they're seen in many respects as a whole lot better than the Russians.
Yeah, I'll continue on the Chinese views of the Turkmen pipeline. And I'm going to answer the question, I guess, from the national level and the corporate level. I think at the national level, I largely agree with what Bobo said. The Chinese government would like to increase the role that natural gas plays in China's energy mix from about 4% in 2010 to 10% in 2015. Imports are going to be a part of that story, and they already have a number of different contracts signed with the Turkmens that total 65 BCM for delivery to China. I don't think we're ever going to see 65 BCM at once, but the point is sort of over a period of time, there's going to be a lot of gas coming. And so this sort of helps China achieve its goal. And again, I think the comparison comparison with Russia is right on, that if you look at the China-Turkmen pipeline, that it was in less than 4 years, it went from sort of conception to operation, which is amazing. And I've had people in industry tell me that for a project of that size, you'd expect, a rule of thumb would be, 5 to 7 years. So they got this done really quickly. I think at a corporate level, if you look at the company who's involved on the Chinese side, which is China National Petroleum Corporation, it's really more of a mixed bag. On the one hand, I think one of the big drivers for CNPC's participation in this project was competition for market share in Guangdong province in southeastern China with another Chinese oil company, China National Offshore Oil Corporation, or CNOOC. CNOOC has a lot of LNG receiving terminals in Guangdong. Guangdong's a very prosperous province, high energy demand, and I think from CNPC's perspective, the sooner that the Turkmen pipeline to China was up and running and feeding natural gas into the west-east pipelines that go across China, went down to Guangdong province, the more market share that they're taking from CNOOC. So that's on the positive side, but I think on the negative side, CNPC is unhappy because they're losing money on this project, that there are still state-set prices for natural gas in China, and as a result of that, CNPC can't fully pass on to customers what it's paying for Turkmen gas, as well as what it's paying for some expensive LNG contracts, like one signed with Qatar back in 2008. And in fact, recently there was a report that came out saying that CNPC lost $7 billion on natural gas imports last year, and most of that pipeline gas from Asia, because of price controls. And and CNPC has turned this around to sort of use it as an argument to sort of push the government to, to move quicker on natural gas price reform. But I think for the company, sort of it's a mixed bag. It's been good for getting market share in Guangdong province, but it's sort of been, bad for the bottom line, at least on this project. And then the other issue I wanted to comment on was the issue of risk. Someone had asked a question about sort of perceptions of risk in the region, and I'll answer that with respect to China. I guess first globally, in that I think for sort of the Chinese companies that are investing overseas and for the Chinese government, increasing attention is being paid to risk and how to de-risk projects, how to manage political risk abroad. And a lot of this is in light of the turmoil that we've seen, in the Middle East, in North Africa in recent years. There have been, for the government's part, there are new regulations sort of calling on the companies to do more. I mean, in the past, a pre-feasibility study was just a piece of paper. You waved at the relevant government body to get approval. But now, I think both the company and the government are looking at that more seriously. And I think the companies are sort of turning to other companies and outside of China to find out how do you manage risk. And so I think more attention is being paid to that. And then I guess to pick one country in Central Asia to look at this issue, I'd focus on Afghanistan, where a Chinese company, Metallurgical Corporation of China, won the tender for the INAC copper deposit back in 2007, and not a lot of progress has been made. They've been really dragging their feet. If you ask the company why they're moving so slowly, they'll say, oh, it's because these ancient relics were discovered and we didn't know about them at the time we signed the agreement, and so we can't do anything because the relics have to be cleared. But my understanding from people who've been down at the mine is that, yes, the relic clearing is impeding progress on some areas of the project, but there are plenty of other things, such as roads, that could be built that relic clearing is not getting in the way of. And I think what's going on here is, besides the fact that this Chinese company, I think, is in a world of trouble financially, is that there's a lot of uncertainty about the post-2014 environment in Afghanistan. And I think this one Chinese company has actually very much loved having U.S. forces on the ground in Logar province. And so they're concerned about the troop drawdown and who's going to be in charge in Afghanistan. And so I think there's a real reluctance to put a lot of money into Afghanistan when they don't know who's going to be in charge, who they need to build alliances with. And so those are my thoughts on the risk issue.
Well, thank you very much to our panel. Angela is ready to close everything up, and let's give a quick round of applause to the panel. Over to you, Angela.
Well, thank you very much. That was a terrific panel. And since I'm now the only thing standing between you and a cocktail reception in the Intercultural Center just around the corner to the left, I am not going to give you a half-hour summary of the conference. It would be impossible. We had terrific speakers. I'm both more enlightened and more confused. And I'm going to leave you just with two questions on the Russia side as I think about everything we heard today, which was, when we next hold this conference, will Russia still be an energy superpower? And if for some reason Russia isn't an energy superpower, will that have somehow had an impact on Russia's modernization project? In other words, will Russia take the need to modernize its own economy and society more seriously? So my final two words, and I do have to thank again Chevron for its financial support of the conference, but I also want to thank my team at CERES for the organizational and all the other support they've given me to make this conference possible, and that's Benjamin Loring, Eugene Imus, and Christina Watts. So please join me in thanking all of them.